Rain struck the mansion in a steady, unforgiving rhythm, drumming against the floor-to-ceiling windows as if demanding attention. Chris leaned back into the velvet armchair, his fingers trembling along the armrest that were beneath his palms slick with faint sweat. A plate had shattered moments ago in the kitchen, its fragments scattered like shattered promises, and the echo still lingered in the cavernous hall. His chest rose and fell unevenly, the shallow rhythm of his breathing filling the vast, empty space around him. The storm outside mirrored the one within, violent, relentless, and impossible to ignore. He had always been careful, meticulous, guarding the walls of his private life behind layers of success and carefully curated appearances. And yet, tonight, those walls had collapsed. A business partner, someone he had trusted more than most, had leaked truths Chris had kept buried. Truths about who he was, about the love he had hidden from the world. The betrayal was surgical, precise, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, trembling under the gaze of millions he would never meet. Chris closed his eyes, willing the pounding of his heart to slow, willing the judgmental voices in his head to quiet. But the sound of the rain refused to relent, hammering against the glass as if mocking his silence. He could still feel the warmth of the last conversation in his office, the smile that had seemed genuine, the handshake that had sealed the deal, or so he had thought. Everything had unraveled in the span of a few sentences, in a single click of a send button that had shared his truth with a world that might never forgive. Chris's lips parted slightly, as if forming words, but no sound came. The room was suffocatingly quiet now, save for the occasional clatter of a loose shutter outside and the relentless patter of rain. The mansion's grandeur, with its polished marble floors and golden chandeliers, only emphasized his isolation. Luxury had never felt so cold. He let his head fall back against the chair, staring up at the high ceiling where shadows from the storm danced across intricate moldings. The shadows seemed to reach for him, whispering reminders of failure, of shame, of exposure. His mind drifted to the people he had loved, those he had allowed close enough to see the real him. The smiles, the small gestures of care, now felt fragile, almost illusory. Had any of it been real? He wondered, a tremor running through his spine. Chris felt the weight of a lifetime compressed into this single, unending night, where every secret he had hidden seemed to glare at him with cruel clarity. Outside, a flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the room in stark white light. Chris flinched at the sudden brightness, a cold rush of panic washing through him. His own heartbeat sounded deafening in his ears, each pulse a reminder of vulnerability, of exposure, of the fragile boundaries he had relied upon to survive in both business and life. He had faked confidence for so long that the collapse now felt unnatural, grotesque in its intensity. What if they knew everything? What if they despised me? The questions clawed at him, relentless, like the wind battering the walls of his sanctuary. He remembered the moment the leak became public, a notification flashing across his phone, the message simple yet devastating. It's out. Everyone knows. The simplicity of the notification made the devastation sharper. Chris's fingers brushed against the screen, slick with rain that had dripped in from the slightly open balcony doors. His breathing became shallow, ragged, and he felt the first real tremor of panic in years. There was no one here to console him, no friend to reach for, no colleague to explain away the storm. Just him, the rain, and the suffocating weight of judgment. The room itself seemed to conspire against him. The polished floors reflected his hunched form, distorted and elongated, making him appear smaller, weaker than he felt, or perhaps than he had ever allowed himself to feel. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was exaggerated in the silence, echoing like a drumbeat marking the fall of someone who had once stood so tall. Chris's chest tightened. The air itself seemed to thicken around him, pressing down with the density of his regret. He pressed his fingers to his temples, willing the memory of the betrayal to dissolve, but it clung, sticky and relentless, refusing to release him. A sudden noise, a creak from the staircase, made him flinch. Perhaps it was a wind. Perhaps someone had entered, but the mansion felt impossibly large, impossibly empty, the corridors stretching like a labyrinth around him. He wanted to call out, to speak, but his voice was caught somewhere in his throat. For the first time, the distance between who he appeared to be and who he truly was became unbearable. The mask of power, the veneer of invincibility, the carefully constructed identity, all of it had crumbled, leaving him raw, exposed, trembling in the storm. His thoughts drifted to the future, or the absence of one? How does one continue when the world knows every secret, when the life you built feels like a lie? Chris's mind raced, and yet, even as panic swelled, he felt a strange, hollow calm settling over him. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps a surrender to the inevitability of the moment, but his body went still, his eyes closing gently. He leaned into the chair as though it could absorb the weight of the world, as though pretending to be unconscious might shield him from the chaos outside. Lightning struck again, closer this time, casting a fleeting glow across the room. Chris's chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately, each breath a quiet act of defiance. If the world wanted to see him broken, perhaps he would give them the illusion, but only the illusion. Beneath the calm, beneath the stillness, a spark lingered, fragile but unyielding, waiting for the right moment to flare. Outside, the rain softened for a brief instant, a fragile pause in the storm, the way dawn sometimes lingers just before sunrise. Chris remained in the armchair, eyes closed, fingers still trembling. Yet in that quiet moment, something shifted. The betrayal, the exposure, the public scrutiny, all of it pressed upon him, heavy and undeniable. And yet, beneath the weight, beneath the fear, a thought whispered through his mind, faint but insistent. This isn't the end. There's something coming, something I can't yet see. The mansion seemed to hold its breath, as though the world itself waited for him to move. A distant thunder rolled, low and ominous, signaling change. And in the silence that followed, with the storm pausing just long enough to allow reflection, Chris's fingers curled slightly around the armrest, a silent grip on the possibility of what was to come. But what Chris didn't know was that his journey was only beginning. The streets were slick with rain, each puddle reflecting the harsh neon glow of streetlights like fractured mirrors. Chris walked aimlessly, his coat drenched, shoes squelching against the wet asphalt, each step a reminder that he no longer belonged anywhere. The city moved around him with indifferent urgency. Taxis honked, distant footsteps echoed against brick walls, and the soft hiss of tires on wet roads created a rhythm that felt cruelly alive. He kept his head down, shoulders hunched, trying to shrink into the shadows, to make himself smaller, invisible. But the world had already noticed. Every glance he caught felt accusatory, every whisper behind him loaded with judgment he couldn't escape. He remembered the notifications, the emails, the social media posts that had betrayed him faster than he could react. Faces he had once trusted now seemed like masks. Smiles turned hollow, eyes narrowed in suspicion. They all know now. They know exactly who I am. The thought twisted in his chest, sharp and unyielding. Panic licked at the edges of his consciousness, yet he forced himself forward, one soggy step at a time. He found himself at a small park, the benches empty except for leaves slick with rain. He sat, shivering, the cold seeping through his coat, soaking into his skin. His hands trembled as he pressed them against his knees, trying to anchor himself in the moment. Hunger gnawed at him, a persistent reminder that life continued even when despair pressed down like a heavy, suffocating blanket. A stray dog approached, cautious, tail tucked, sniffing at his shoes. Chris offered a piece of stale bread he found in his coat pocket, and for a moment, connection flickered, a tiny ember in the shadowed night. The dog accepted the offering and padded off, leaving Chris alone again, the silence deep and insistent. Rain pelted his face, cold and relentless, and he tilted his head back, letting it run over his closed eyes. Tears mingled with the water, indistinguishable, washing over the shame and the fear. He thought of the people he had relied upon, the partners, the friends, the colleagues who had turned their backs the moment the truth emerged. Every memory was now tinged with betrayal. The life he had built, the empire of his mind and ambition, seemed to crumble beneath him. He felt the sharp sting of humiliation, a weight pressing against his chest that made each breath a labor. Chris's mind wandered back to the mansion, to the warmth of a life now out of reach. He imagined the chandeliers, the polished floors, the distant hum of a fireplace, and the illusion of safety that had kept him insulated. That world had felt invincible, untouchable, and yet here he was, soaked to the bone, trembling on a park bench in the rain. He shivered violently, the cold seeping into his bones, and wrapped his arms around himself. He whispered into the wind, though he knew no one would hear, "I don't belong anywhere anymore." Night deepened, swallowing the city in darkness. Street lamps flickered like hesitant lanterns, the light dancing over puddles, illuminating Chris's gaunt face, the dark circles under his eyes, the hollowed expression of someone who had been stripped of certainty. He could feel his pulse in his temples, each beat a drum of exhaustion and fear. Hunger, fatigue, and loneliness wove together into a tapestry of despair that threatened to unravel him entirely. He tried to remember the rules of the world he had once mastered, how to negotiate, how to present himself, how to survive, but now those skills felt useless, irrelevant against the quiet cruelty of isolation. He rose slowly, each movement deliberate, as if testing whether his limbs still obeyed. The park stretched out around him, deserted except for the occasional rustle of wind through wet branches. He walked on, boots squelching in puddles, mind restless, body aching, heart heavy with the weight of shame. He passed a street vendor selling steaming dumplings, their aroma tantalizing, but he did not stop. The thought of interacting, of revealing even a hint of his vulnerability to another human, felt impossible. His pride, or perhaps his fear, tethered him to the shadows. Hours passed in slow, wet anonymity. Chris crouched beneath an awning in some unremarkable corner, listening to the city breathe in rain-soaked whispers. Each drop hitting the pavement sounded like a metronome marking the passage of his suffering. In the distance, laughter echoed, a reminder of lives moving forward, unaffected by his collapse. He longed for that ease, that lightness, yet he knew it was a world closed to him now. Every reflection in the rain-slicked streets mirrored a version of himself he no longer recognized, exhausted, exposed, broken, yet stubbornly still alive. He paused in front of a closed cafe, peering through the fogged glass at strangers sipping coffee, oblivious of the storm outside and the man huddled in the rain. Their warmth, their casual ease, felt like both a blessing and a punishment. He pressed his forehead to the glass, watching steam rise from cups and linger in the warm air. The contrast of life continuing so casually, so brightly, made the hollow ache in his chest sharper. He wondered how long he could endure this anonymity, this invisible exile from the world he had once ruled. In a quiet corner of the park later that night, Chris finally sank to the ground, pulling his knees to his chest. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, a soft patter now rather than the relentless drum of hours before. His soaked hair clung to his forehead, eyes half closed, staring at the wet leaves around him. Each breath was a negotiation with despair, each heartbeat a reminder that he still existed in a world that had seemed determined to erase him. Why does no one care? He thought, the question lingering unanswered in the cold night air. A distant flicker of light caught his attention, an old lamppost, its bulb sputtering but still glowing faintly. It cast a pool of yellow across the damp ground, illuminating the glistening puddles and the darkened outline of a figure approaching from the other side of the park. Chris tensed, unsure whether it was danger or salvation. The figure moved closer, steps deliberate, careful, yet filled with purpose. There was a kindness in the way they paused before him, offering a handkerchief, a quiet nod, a gesture small but monumental in its significance. Chris stayed, unsure if he could trust what he saw, unsure if the world had any good left to offer him. Yet in that faint glow, under the sputtering light and amidst the soaked shadows, he felt the first fragile stirrings of hope. Something was coming, something that might not erase the betrayal, not undo the humiliation, but perhaps, just perhaps, offer a bridge back to life. And as a stranger knelt beside him, voice soft but insistent, offering warmth where none had existed, Chris realized the night's despair was not the final chapter. There was movement in the stillness, a possibility that survival did not mean surrender. The rain slowed further, the puddles reflecting both the lamppost and the glimmer in Chris's eyes, an ember of resilience flickering faintly against the darkness. Somewhere, a hand reached out, though Chris didn't yet know if he could trust it. The next morning, sunlight broke through the heavy clouds in fragile streaks, painting the wet streets in muted gold. Chris awoke on a narrow cot inside a small, sparsely furnished room, unfamiliar walls enclosing him like a quiet confession. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread and polished wood, a contrast to the cold dampness of the park. He blinked, disoriented, the warmth of a thin blanket around his shoulders both alien and comforting. Somewhere nearby, the soft hum of a kettle boiled, mingling with a distant chirp of bird beginning their hesitant morning chorus. For the first time in hours, perhaps days, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, his lungs filling with air that felt almost alive. She appeared then, stepping lightly across the wooden floor, her presence gentle but deliberate. The housekeeper's movements were unhurried, precise, yet carried a softness that seemed to acknowledge Chris without forcing him into conversation. Her eyes, calm and observant, traced the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands curled nervously around the blanket. She did not speak at once. Instead, she set a steaming cup of tea on a small table beside him, the scent of chamomile wafting upward, a balm to frayed nerves. Chris's lips parted slightly, a word forming and dying in his throat. She waited, patient, her silence a reassurance that no immediate judgment would follow. Chris tried to recall how he had arrived here, the details blurred by exhaustion and rain-soaked memory. He had no words to offer, no explanations that could justify the rawness of his state. The housekeeper sat in a chair across from him, hands folded calmly in her lap, her eyes never leaving him. There was no pity, no condescension, only a quiet acknowledgment of his presence, as though she understood what it meant to be exposed, to be stripped of pretense. The room, sparse as it was, became a cocoon of fragile safety. He sipped the tea hesitantly, the warmth spreading through him, easing the ache in his chest. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine comfort as a real possibility, a fleeting thought that seemed almost heretical. His fingers traced the rim of the cup, trembling slightly, and he noticed a faint scar along the knuckle of his right hand, a small imperfection that reminded him of vulnerability and mortality. The housekeeper observed him without comment, a quiet sentinel, letting him explore his own humanity at his own pace. She finally spoke, her voice soft, deliberate, carrying a cadence that seemed to slow the air around them. "You don't have to explain right now. Not yet." The words landed lightly, yet each syllable carried gravity. Chris's throat tightened. He wanted to respond, to explain himself, to justify the collapse of his carefully constructed life, but no words came. Instead, he nodded faintly, acknowledging her presence, acknowledging the safety of the space, even if only temporarily. The trust required felt monumental, yet somehow possible, tethered by a quiet steadiness. Over the hours, small gestures began to build a fragile bridge between them. She brought a bowl of porridge, warm and simple, and Chris ate slowly, feeling each spoonful nourish more than just hunger. The clink of the spoon against the bowl, the soft steam curling upward, became a meditation. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening and still. Light reflected off puddles, flickering across the room as if nature itself conspired to provide solace. Chris allowed himself to linger on the sensation, the way the warmth seeped into his limbs, the way the quiet steadied his heartbeat. She did not pry into his past, did not question his sudden presence. Instead, she offered small acts of care, folding a damp coat, setting a fire in the hearth, arranging a few flowers in a cracked vase by the window. Each gesture, simple and deliberate, carried a weight of understanding. Chris watched, fascinated by the grace and routine, the way someone could offer kindness without demanding gratitude, without expecting repayment. It was a rhythm he had forgotten, a cadence of trust and attention that existed outside the calculated structures of his old life. The hours stretched, punctuated by silence, by the quiet drip of a faucet, by the distant hum of a city beginning to wake. Chris explored the room slowly, touching the worn wood of the table, tracing the spines of a few well-used books on a shelf. Each object, mundane to an observer, became a reminder of human endurance, of the small beauty and ordinariness. He realized he had spent so long chasing recognition, chasing achievement, that he had forgotten the quiet power of presence, of being seen and not judged. A shadow flickered across the floor as she moved to close the curtains against the morning glare. Her hands lingered on the fabric for a moment, adjusting, smoothing, creating order without intrusion. Chris watched her, awareness sharpening, and for the first time he considered the possibility that safety was not an illusion. Perhaps it could be offered, received, and sustained. Perhaps someone could care without strings, without expectation, and perhaps, somehow, that care could extend to him. As the day unfolded, Chris felt an unfamiliar sensation, stillness without fear, observation without threat. He found himself speaking in fragments, words spilling slowly, unpolished, yet truthful. I didn't know where to go," he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. The housekeeper nodded, her eyes steady, unshaken. No judgment, no interruption, only presence. Chris realized how deeply he had craved this acknowledgement, this quiet acceptance, a mirror to the inner fracture that had been so violently exposed. Sunlight shifted to the window, illuminating dust motes suspended in the warm air. The room seemed to breathe alongside him, each inhalation a small act of reclaiming something lost. He could feel the tension loosening, the constant ache of vigilance easing, replaced by the fragile curiosity of trust. Yet even as comfort grew, a part of him remained alert, wary of the outside world, wary of returning to the spaces that had exposed him so cruelly. Toward evening, a knock came at the door. Chris froze, pulse quickening. The world outside was still a place of uncertainty, of judgment, of exposure. The housekeeper paused, eyes meeting his, a subtle question in her gaze. "Are you ready?" Chris could not answer, could not yet bridge the distance to the unknown visitor. But he felt the stirrings of courage, the tiniest flicker of resolve. The quiet sanctuary of the room had offered him safety, yet it also reminded him that life beyond its walls awaited, demanding reckoning. And in that moment, as shadows lengthened and the golden light faded, Chris understood something both terrifying and vital. The world outside had not disappeared, nor had the dangers or betrayals that had brought him here. But for the first time since the storm began, he felt a small, trembling certainty that he could face it, that he could step forward, guided by this unexpected kindness. Even in the sanctuary of warmth and light, Chris knew the past had not released him, and the truth waiting beyond the door was closer than he realized. Chris had begun to trust the rhythm of the small house, the quiet cadence of the housekeeper's presence and the warmth that seeped into him like sunlight through fog. Yet even in this fragile sanctuary, an unease lingered, like the distant rumble of thunder after a storm. It came as she moved silently across the room one afternoon, her hands clutching a small envelope, worn at the edges, as though it had been carried for years. Chris noticed the weight of it in her fingers before she spoke, and instinctively his heart constricted. She did not immediately offer explanation. Instead, she set the envelope gently on the table, the paper soft beneath his gaze. Chris reached toward it hesitantly, the tremor in his fingers betraying both anticipation and dread. There was no flourish, no dramatic reveal, only the quiet gravity of someone who had seen too much yet chose to speak carefully. "This belongs to you," she said, her voice steady, yet threaded with a gravity that demanded attention. Chris swallowed hard. He did not yet understand the significance, but the tension was palpable, pressing into his chest like the rain-soaked streets of his earlier despair. He opened the envelope slowly, the crease of the paper soft under his fingertips. Inside lay a series of letters and photographs, the edges curling slightly with age and handling. As he unfolded the first letter, words scrawled in familiar handwriting struck him with an almost physical force. Memories long buried rose to the surface, conversations, promises, and moments that had seemed insignificant at the time but now revealed themselves as threads in a larger, hidden narrative. Each sentence carried the weight of revelation, each word a brushstroke painting the outline of a past he thought he knew. His chest tightened as he read the letters, hands trembling. The words disclosed betrayals he had never anticipated, not from strangers but from those he had trusted most. The photographs, carefully preserved, documented scenes of duplicity, moments where appearances had been manipulated, truths twisted to serve others' ambitions. Chris realized that his downfall had not been a singular act of exposure but a culmination of years of hidden agendas, deliberate manipulation, and unseen cruelty. The world he had inhabited was far more treacherous than he had ever imagined. A silence descended upon the room, heavy and suffocating. Chris's mind raced, connecting dots he had never considered, recognizing the shadows behind every betrayal, every slight, every carefully hidden resentment. He could hear his own breath, sharp and uneven, the faint creak of the floorboard beneath the housekeeper's careful movements. She did not intrude, did not attempt to guide him through the revelation. Her silence was a recognition of the enormity of his discovery, a quiet offering of space to process the weight of truth. As he turned another photograph, Chris saw himself depicted in scenes he barely remembered, meetings with colleagues whose smiles now appeared sinister, private moments captured without consent, letters he had thought lost now resurfacing with new meaning. Each image deepened his understanding of the intricacies that had led to his public humiliation, each revelation reframing the narrative he had believed for so long. The sense of isolation he had felt in the streets, the humiliation on the park bench, the collapse in the mansion, They were no longer merely failures of circumstance, but components of a larger, orchestrated betrayal. A single tear traced down his cheek, unbidden. The housekeeper moved closer then, placing a hand softly on the edge of the table, an anchor without intrusion. Chris flinched at first, then relaxed, recognizing the gesture as one of solidarity, not judgment. Her eyes met his, steady and unshaken, conveying an understanding that transcended words. He had believed he had been alone, entirely at the mercy of a world eager to expose and exploit him, but this quiet presence reminded him that connection could still exist, even in the aftermath of deliberate harm. The letters revealed not only betrayal, but a pattern of fear and secrecy extending far beyond his personal collapse. Chris saw how the very individuals who had undermined him were themselves constrained by unspoken pressures, secrets, and unresolved pain. The revelation shifted something within him, a subtle but profound understanding that cruelty was often rooted in desperation, in past wounds, in the very human fear of exposure. He recognized the complexity of the world he had navigated, the intertwining of power and vulnerability, and felt a tremor of empathy alongside the anger and grief. Hours passed in the quiet of the room, punctuated only by the occasional sigh of the housekeeper as she moved about her work, tending to mundane tasks with the precision of someone accustomed to both discipline and care. Chris remained seated, letters spread before him, absorbing the nuances, the implications, the silent testimony of those who had acted in darkness. Each photograph, each scrawled word, became a mirror reflecting not just the betrayals inflicted upon him, but the interconnected web of human flaws that had shaped the events leading to his downfall. He leaned back in the chair, head tilting toward the ceiling, absorbing both the weight and the clarity of the revelation. His hands, once trembling uncontrollably, now clutched the letters with intention, a grounding in the midst of emotional turbulence. The storm within him had shifted from raw panic to quiet comprehension, understanding that the past was not simply a collection of mistakes or betrayals, but a complex tapestry woven from fear, ambition, and concealment. Chris spoke then, voice low, almost inaudible, yet charged with significance. I didn't see it before. I thought it was just me, that I had failed alone. But this... His gaze swept over the letters, the photographs, the evidence of a hidden network of motives and secrets. He paused, breath catching, realizing that the world he had believed against him was more complicated, more human, than he had allowed himself to acknowledge. The anger lingered, but it was tempered now by insight, by recognition that reckoning required understanding as well as confrontation. Outside, the wind began to rise, stirring the trees and rattling the window panes. The day was fading, yet light still lingered, slipping through the edges of the curtains, casting a soft glow over the letters and photograph that had transformed his perception. Chris realized the magnitude of what he held in his hands. Not only evidence of betrayal, but a map of human frailty and resilience, a key to understanding the forces that had shaped his life and the lives of those around him. And then he looked up at the housekeeper, whose eyes reflected both compassion and a quiet insistence. Her voice, when it came, was calm but deliberate. "You have seen the truth, Chris. Now you must decide what to do with it." Her words were simple, yet weighty, carrying the unspoken understanding that revelation demanded action, that clarity required courage. The letters, the photographs, the weight of discovery, they were no longer just private torment. They were a call to engagement, to confrontation, to the possibility of reclaiming agency. Chris swallowed hard, feeling a mix of fear, determination, and the faintest trace of hope. The room, once a haven of tentative safety, now felt like the threshold of something larger, a crossing from private despite to public reckoning. He recognized the challenge before him, the need to navigate not only the external forces of betrayal, but also the internal landscape of doubt, fear, and moral responsibility. And as he gathered the letters, a chill of awareness coursed through him. The revelation was not an endpoint, but a beginning. Beyond these walls, beyond this sanctuary of warmth and trust, the world waited, demanding confrontation, courage, and reckoning. The housekeeper stepped back, her eyes steady, giving him space, offering him both support and the unspoken expectation that he could rise to meet the truth. The secret had been uncovered, but Chris knew in his heart that facing it would demand more than courage. It would demand everything he had yet to discover about himself. The hall was alive with murmurs, a tide of voices that swelled and receded like restless waves. Chris stepped into the room, each footfall echoing on the polished floor, reverberating against walls lined with faces both familiar and foreign. Cameras flashed intermittently, their light sharp, almost intrusive, illuminating every line of tension etched across his face. He felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, some curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile. The air was dense, thick with expectation, and yet beneath it, beneath the surface clamor, Chris felt the faint pulse of purpose, the quiet insistence that he had arrived here for a reason greater than his own fear. He moved toward the center, past rows of chairs filled with colleagues, journalists, and strangers whose opinions had once shaped his every thought. The scent of polished wood and faint perfume mingled with a metallic tang of anticipation. Chris's pulse quickened, not with panic this time, but with a heightened awareness of stakes long ignored. The letters and photograph from the housekeeper still rested in his coat pocket, their presence a silent reminder that the truth was no longer abstract. It was tangible, undeniable, a force demanding acknowledgement. As he paused before the podium, the room still for a brief, charged heartbeat. Chris raised his eyes to meet the crowd, scanning faces for glimpses of recognition, of understanding, of contempt. There were whispers, low and indistinct, yet their intent was clear. He could feel the energy pressing in, almost like a physical weight, urging him to retreat, to succumb to the familiar temptation of invisibility. And yet, beneath the anxiety, beneath the tremor of uncertainty, he discovered a fragile resolve, the realization that silence was no longer an option. He cleared his throat, the sound startling in the hush that had fallen. "I am here," he began, voice steadying with each word, "because the truth cannot remain hidden any longer." The simplicity of the statement belied its power, and he saw eyes shift, expressions faltering under the gravity of acknowledgement. Chris felt the tremor of nerves, the memory of betrayal and humiliation, but it no longer controlled him. He spoke deliberately, each syllable carrying weight, each pause calibrated to allow the audience to absorb not only the facts but the human heart behind them. The letters and photographs had given him perspective, revealing the network of fear, secrecy, and manipulation that had led to his fall. Chris did not accuse blindly. He named names carefully, connecting actions to motives, exposing patterns without descending into vengeance. The murmurs grew louder at first, then receded as people listened, the crowd suspended between disbelief and understanding. He described not only the betrayals that had targeted him, but the fears and insecurities that had driven those actions, humanizing even those who had sought to harm him. The room, once a theater of judgment, became a space of reckoning, illuminated by the light of honesty. He paused, letting the silence speak, his hands resting lightly on the podium. The wind outside stirred banners, the fluttering fabric audible through open windows, a gentle reminder that the world beyond the hall continued, indifferent yet waiting. Faces softened, some with empathy, some with surprise, and Chris felt the rare sensation of being heard, of being truly seen. It was not applause that he sought. Applause would come later, if at all, but recognition of reality, the acknowledgement that truth, however inconvenient, deserved presence. One by one, questions came, voices from the crowd piercing the quiet with curiosity and accusation alike. Chris answered without haste, without defensiveness, allowing the clarity of his understanding to guide him. He spoke of fear and courage, of mistakes and accountability, of the hidden pressures that had shaped the choices of those around him. There was a rhythm to his words, a cadence that held attention, that softened judgment, that drew understanding from even the most skeptical corners of the room. Every gesture, every pause, every careful glance reinforced the sincerity behind his voice. Outside, the wind intensified, rattling window panes, stirring the banners that flapped against their poles. It was as if the world itself held its breath, the natural elements echoing the tension and release within the hall. Chris noticed a young man near the back, hands clenched, eyes wide with recognition and relief, a mirror of the vulnerability he had once felt in the rain-soaked park. In that moment, Chris understood that courage could ripple outward, that his stand here, vulnerable and honest, might ignite understanding, empathy, and even change. The room shifted as murmurs became whispers. Whispers became thoughtful nods. Chris realized that confrontation did not require aggression, that victory was not measured in anger or humiliation, but in the moral clarity of presenting truth to those willing to witness it. He saw colleagues soften, Journalists adjust their pens, some simply leaning forward, their expressions open, absorbing the reality of his words. He felt the quiet swell of accomplishment, not personal triumph, but the sense that justice, in its simplest form, had been acknowledged. And yet, even in this moment of fragile victory, Chris knew the world outside the hall had not disappeared. The letters, the photographs, the revelations, they were only the beginning. Beyond the windows, beyond the curious eyes, the same forces of fear, secrecy, and judgment still lingered, waiting for missteps, for weakness, for hesitation. He felt the responsibility settle over him, heavy yet clarifying. To navigate the path ahead, he would need more than courage. He would need persistence, vigilance, and integrity. He stepped back from the podium as the room shifted, whispers of conversation rising like currents around him. The housekeeper, who had quietly accompanied him to the hall, remained in the background, her calm presence a reminder of the sanctuary from which he had emerged. Chris's gaze lingered on her briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the guidance, support, and trust that had allowed him to face the world today. Her nod was small, understated, yet it carried profound affirmation. He was not alone, even in this arena of scrutiny. Chris adjusted the coat over his shoulders and took a final, deliberate breath. The crowd waited, anticipating his next move, their eyes questioning, weighing, absorbing. He felt the surge of wind once more through the open windows, the banners snapping sharply against the poles, the distant city alive beyond the walls of the hall. And he knew, with a quiet certainty, that this confrontation was both an ending and a beginning, a bridge between the collapse that had brought him here and the life he had yet to reclaim, grounded in truth, courage, and moral clarity. The applause, when it came, was faint but real. But Chris knew the battle was far from over, and the forces he had exposed were only just beginning to stir. The morning light fell softly across the courtyard, casting long, golden beams that painted the stone walls in warm hues. Chris walked slowly along the path, each step deliberate, absorbing the calm that had replaced the storm of the previous days. The letters and photograph that had once weighed on him now rested safely in a drawer, their truths acknowledged and understood, their lessons integrated. The housekeeper followed at a measured distance, a quiet sentinel, her presence a reminder that trust had been known, nurtured, and now returned. A breeze carried the faint scent of blossom from nearby trees, the fragrance mingling with the earthy aroma of dew-soaked grass. Chris paused, letting the sensation settle into his chest, a lightness he had not known in months. His hands brushed against the petals, delicate, alive, and he felt the fragile beauty of small, everyday moments, the kind he had once overlooked in pursuit of power, recognition, and control. Each sound, each light touch, each subtle warmth reminded him that life continued not only in moments of triumph but in quiet resilience. The mansion beyond the courtyard seemed transformed, less a monument to isolation and more a reflection of reclaimed possibility. Windows gleamed in the morning sun, curtains swaying gently in the breeze, and for the first time, Chris noticed the small details he had ignored. The cracks in the masonry that had been patched with care, the soft rustle of leaves against the walls, the way shadows played along corners previously unnoticed. The house had endured neglect and fear, yet it still stood, a testament to endurance, much like himself. He reached a bench near the fountain, its water rippling softly in the morning light. Sitting, he allowed his thoughts to drift to the people he had confronted, the public reckoning that had unfolded with tension and quiet courage. Faces and voices replayed in his mind, skepticism giving way to acknowledgement, anger tempered by understanding, the subtle yet profound shift that occurs when truth is presented without vengeance. He realized that confrontation had not merely been an act of exposure, it had been an act of reconciliation, a reclamation of integrity against forces that sought to diminish him. The housekeeper approached, carrying a small tray with a steaming cup of tea and a slice of fresh bread. She placed it beside him, hand steady, her eyes meeting his with a gentle warmth that carried unspoken affirmation. Chris nodded, gratitude settling quietly within him. He took a sip of the tea, the warmth flowing through him, a subtle echo of the deeper restoration that had begun. In this quiet exchange, he understood that redemption was not something granted. It was cultivated through trust, through vulnerability, and through the courage to stand in the light of one's own truth. As he ate, Chris reflected on the journey that had brought him here, the rain-soaked park bench, the long nights of despair, the small gestures of kindness that had bridged the gap between isolation and hope. Each step, each act of courage, each acknowledgement of truth had carried him closer to this fragile equilibrium. He realized that survival had required more than physical endurance. It had demanded an emotional reckoning, the willingness to confront not only external betrayals but the inner fears and self-doubt that had long shadowed him. The fountain burbled softly, its water catching the morning sun and scattering light across the courtyard. Chris's gaze lingered on the ripples, and he thought of the people he had once feared would never forgive, would never understand, would never see beyond their own assumptions. And yet, he recognized the truth that had been quietly revealed. Confrontation, honesty, and courage had the power to transform perception, to awaken empathy, and to open paths toward reconciliation, even with those who had once seemed irredeemable. A movement at the edge of the courtyard drew his attention. A figure approached, familiar yet altered by time and circumstance. It was one of the colleagues who had played a role in his exposure, their expression tentative, uncertain, a mixture of guilt and hope. Chris felt the stirrings of the old anger, the echoes of humiliation. Yet he restrained them, letting understanding and perspective temper the response. The colleague stopped a few paces away, hands slightly raised in acknowledgement, eyes searching for a sign of reception. Chris took a deep breath, rising slowly to meet them, the sunlight catching in his eyes, a quiet strength radiating in his posture. The colleague began, voice faltering. I want to say I'm sorry for the part one played, for not seeing the consequences. Chris watched, listening, his chest rising and falling steadily, the old tremor replaced by measured calm. He nodded, allowing the sincerity of the apology to resonate. It matters, he said softly. Acknowledgement is a first step. Now we can build from here, or we can choose to remain broken by the past. The words carried weight, not judgment, but clarity, an invitation toward reconciliation rather than confrontation. The colleague's eyes glistened with unspoken relief, and for a moment, the courtyard seemed suspended in quiet understanding. Chris realized that the journey had not only been about exposing deception, but about reclaiming the humanity that had been obscured by fear, secrecy, and ambition. The revelation of truth, the courage to confront, and the capacity to forgive had combined to create a space where healing could begin, not just for himself, but for those around him. Sunlight shifted across the courtyard, brushing over the fountain, the stone benches, and the subtle cracks that had healed over time. Chris felt the weight of months of fear and isolation begin to lift, replaced by a sense of grounded purpose. He recognized that redemption was neither instantaneous nor absolute. It was a series of choices, small and deliberate, rooted in courage, empathy, and unwavering commitment to truth. Each gesture, each acknowledgement, each quiet act of kindness had compounded into a force stronger than fear or betrayal. A soft breeze rustled the blossoms overhead, petals drifting gently to the ground like fragile fragments of hope. Chris reached out, letting a petal rest in his palm, and felt a quiet serenity settle within him. He understood that the story of collapse, revelation, confrontation, and reconciliation had brought him full circle, not to the life he had once known, but to a life richer in authenticity, in moral clarity, and in human connection. He felt the delicate power of vulnerability, the courage inherent in transparency, and the quiet strength of resilience that had carried him through the storm. The housekeeper stood nearby, her eyes reflecting the calm triumph of someone who had guided another through darkness without interference. Chris nodded to her, a wordless expression of gratitude and recognition. She smiled faintly, stepping back, giving him space to inhabit his reclaimed life fully. Beyond the courtyard, the city stretched outward, a reminder that the world continued in all its complexity, yet he was now equipped to navigate it with insight, courage, and integrity. And as Chris inhaled deeply, the scent of earth and blossoms mingling with sunlight and morning air, he felt a final clarity emerge. The battles had not ended. Life would continue to test, challenge, and provoke. Yet he was no longer the man crushed by exposure and betrayal. He was someone who had faced fear, embraced vulnerability, and emerged with moral clarity. And in that realization, he understood that courage was not a single act, but a continuous practice, a choice renewed with every step forward. The storm had passed, but its echoes remained, and Chris knew that the life he would now choose, guided by truth and tempered by courage, was only just beginning.